Welcome to MarsCast, the official podcast of Mid-America Reformed Seminary. I'm your host, Jared Luchabor, and today we're beginning a four-part series that explores the story of the United Reformed Churches in North America, the URC-NA. For those who worship in a URC congregation, you're aware that this is a federation with deep roots, but how did it get here? What theological concerns sparked this movement? What struggles shaped its identity? Well, over the next 4 episodes, we'll trace that journey with our veteran president, Dr. Cornelis Venema of Mid-America Reformed Seminary, who lived through these events and continues to faithfully serve its churches. Today's episode focuses on the theological crisis that was brewing in the Christian Reformed Church during the 1980s and early 1990s. This is foundational for understanding everything that follows: the consistorial conferences, the alliance of Reformed churches, and ultimately the formation of the URC-NA in 1996. So, let's dive in. First, Dr. Venema, let's look at the primary theological issues within the CRC in the 1980s and early 1990s that led to the formation of the URC. I think this is a foundational question. Women in office, it often gets highlighted, but my sense is that it was symptomatic of deeper concerns about biblical authority and confessional fidelity. So help us understand what the primary theological issues were that made it clear a new direction was necessary.
Well, first of all, you're quite correct. The issue wasn't solely the question of whether women should be ordained to all of the offices in the church. That was more of what I would call the most obvious symptom of a deeper issue, which I think governed pretty much the entire history of the CRC in the post-World War II period, from the debates that took place in a early part of the 1950s. I'll just give you a couple of examples. In 1952, almost the entire faculty of Calvin Seminary was dismissed. At the time, they said the dismissal was because of personality differences and disunity and discord among the faculty. But it actually reflected a difference of perspective and approach in the use of confessions in theological study and in the science of theology at the seminary. There was a more progressive side of the faculty that wanted not so much to insist that men who taught at the seminary had gone to Reformed institutions where the Reformed confessions inform the kind of education they received. And the initial presenting reason for that debate was the more conservative confessional side of the faculty, concerned to retain the confessional integrity of the CRC, wanted Calvin Seminary to have its own THD, or Doctor of Theology degree, so as to ensure that the men who taught at the seminary would be thoroughly confessional. Well, the Senate in 1952 chose to view the whole disruption as merely a matter of personality conflict. But there was a deeper issue then, and that surfaced in the subsequent history of the CRC again and again. In an article I wrote some years ago for a festschrift for Dr. Godfrey at Westminster, I detail a whole series of, beginning in the early 60s, into the 70s and into the 80s in the CRC. I can't go into the details of this, but repeatedly synods would appoint study committees to look at the question of Scripture's inspiration and its authority. And it started with a debate and a study committee report, the first one in 1961, which was a very good report. But the occasion for it was one of the professors at Calvin Seminary made a complaint against the president, John Crumminga, that he had compromised the doctrine of Scripture and its inspiration, plenary inspiration particularly, because he said, well, we have to make a distinction between the center of Scripture and what lies on the periphery. And there may be things on the periphery, historical records and other types of texts in the Bible that are, dare we say, characterized by some inaccuracies, some approximations that fall short, maybe even a little exaggeration. So you have a complaint brought against the president of the seminary, and it was resolved in part through the receiving of a report in 1961 on the inspiration and authority of Scripture, which I often say to my students was an excellent report, represented the consensus of the church at the time, but it didn't prevail ultimately, because there were a subsequent series of study committee reports. Probably the most notorious was in the early 70s. It was called Report 44. Now, it gets confusing because there was more than one Report 44. There was a Report 44 at one synod dealing with the nature and extent of biblical authority, and there was later another Report 44 that dealt with the question of office and ordination. I'll start with the Report 44 in the early 70s. That report was much disputed in the CRC. There were conservatives in the CRC that said it was a good report. There was a large number of more conservative confessional members and office bearers in the CRC that were of the conviction that even the very language, the nature and extent of biblical authority is problematic, because the report said you have to read the Bible with an understanding that it has a redemptive purpose. And so that the history recorded in the Scripture, we mayn't in any way compromise its historical reality. It's a faithful record of what God did in the course of redemptive history, but it does have a focus. And so the biblical writers, though the event character of the history of redemption cannot be compromised, it's certainly the case that in the biblical record of Israel's history, some things are highlighted, other things are ignored. It's not secular history. This report actually became the occasion for, in the late 80s, further controversy, because there were a number of professors at the college, Calvin, and also at the seminary, who appealed to that report on the nature of and extent of biblical authority to, in some way, compromise or allegedly compromise the historicity of the early chapters of Genesis. And at that time, this is one of the swirling of a multitude of issues in the CRC in the period. At that particular moment, a lot of focus came to be fixed on the question of the account of creation in Genesis 1. But it was, again, part of a larger set of issues: how to interpret the Scriptures, how to maintain a high view of their authority, sola scriptura, their inspiration, their trustworthiness. The language of infallibility and inerrancy was much disputed, not only in the CRC, but also in the broader evangelical community in the 70s, when the Chicago Statement on Biblical Inerrancy was issued. So what I'm getting at is, throughout this long and complicated, and it seems never-ending series of controversies, the focal point was always on what we confess in our confessions about the nature of the Scriptures, their inspiration and authority, believing without a doubt all things contained therein, to use the language of Article 7 of the Belgic Confession. It became increasingly the concern of more biblical, let's say, and confessionally faithful office bearers in the CRC. And the evidence for this was in actions and decisions that were being made at Senate, that we were, as a denomination, losing our grip on our historic view of scriptural authority, and as well the strong adherence to the confessions on a number of points. I'll just illustrate it, but not go into the details of the debates. But there were controversies about the canons of Dort in this period. A missions professor at the seminary, seemingly on the pages of one of the periodicals of the denomination. One of those at that time was Torch and Trumpet, now known as The Outlook. There was a rival magazine of the more progressive wing of the denomination. It was in that magazine, whose name just escapes me now, that this missions professor contested the doctrine of what we often refer to as limited, I prefer the language of definite atonement or particular redemption. That led to an entire synod in 1967 that met at the end of the summer after the regular meeting to adjudicate the controversy in the church on that issue. Now, there were subsequent chapters to that. In the 80s, Dr. Boer, who had taught at the seminary, was one of the professors fired in 1952, had been on the missionary field in Nigeria. He brought what's called a gravamen, or an official complaint, against one of the articles in the first main head of doctrine of the Canons of Dort dealing with reprobation. He contested the biblical warrant for any such doctrine. Now, he lost the case at Synod, but there were any number of rumblings in this period. There was first the love of God controversy. What about definite atonement, limited atonement? What about the doctrine of reprobation? There was a minister in the CRC who began to publish books advocating something that he referred to as a form of universalism, that you're to presume the election and salvation of all persons unless, when confronted with the gospel call, they persist in impenitence. So that was a whole series of debates. There were debates about the topic of creation and evolution. There were clearly professors at the seminary, certainly at the college level. Howard Van Til, a professor of astronomy, published a book entitled The Fourth Day, and he quite clearly rejected the historicity of the early chapters of Genesis, not just the account of creation, but the early narratives, made a strict separation between what he called the kernel or the core religious truth of Scripture and its, as he called it, the historical packaging. So the debate at that point was, is he compromising the event character that the older report in 1972 says you may not compromise? There were committees appointed. There was even another, I'll wrap it up with this. I haven't even talked about the women in office debate, which swirled along from late 70s all the way into the mid-90s. When the matter was finally settled, it went back and forth like a ping pong ball. I think it was 1990, Senate made a decision to go ahead. They reversed that decision, didn't ratify it in 1993. Then they made another decision in 94, and that ultimately prevailed in 1995. But all of this is to say, the other debate, I need to insert that in here because it fits with this entire narrative. There was in 1990 a study committee report on general revelation, science, and special revelation. And the product of that study committee, it came to the foreground when the committee basically, in its report, took the position that when science engages with the study of the world, the cosmos, as God made it, created it, the theory of evolution is the prevailing scientific theory to account for the coming to be of the world with the diversity of life forms over a vast period of time. The report was, generally speaking, this is a simplistic way of putting it, of the opinion that if science comes to a somewhat settled conclusion on this matter, we have to reread the scriptures and take a position. There was an appendix to the report that basically gave you a sort of Reader's Digest version of the popular view that prevails today on the doctrine of evolution. Well, at the Synod of Dort, I mean the one that took place in Sioux Center, I don't remember if it was 1990 or 1991 just now, but it received the report, and there was a huge debate on the floor because there was a minority of the study committee that asked Synod, when they received the report, you don't necessarily approve the report, that the report and the relation between general and special revelation is such that we may not deny the immediate creation of Adam from the dust of the earth, into whom God breathed the breath of life and called the human race, Adam and Eve, Eve from Adam, at the dawn of human history, without any pre-human hominoid or less than human ancestry or predecessors. So that got debated, and the recommendation was that we can't deny the immediate creation of Adam. That passed, but it was very complicated at Synod because they added a footnote that said that this does not prevent theologians and scientists and professors, office bearers, from investigating and floating alternative viewpoints, even more radical views in terms of the evolutionary emergence of the human race. So if you were to throw into the mix, and I haven't said much about that at this point, what was really truly the most hot button issue, because it was so patent, it was so clear, it affected every church, the issue of women's ordination. Because if you held a traditional position that the Scriptures prohibit the ordination of women to ruling office, the offices of the church, as did those in the denomination that were seeking to remain faithful to the Scriptures and the confessions, this was a crisis of conscience, because churches delegate office bearers to assemblies, classis, and synod. And if you don't regard someone as properly or lawfully ordained to the office, this is why the CRC, when they first passed the decision to permit the ordination of women at the level of the local consistories, they left to the freedom of classes to decide whether they would seat delegates. Now that's changed. It's no longer the case, with one classis by way of exception in the CRC, that women delegates may not be seated at the classis meeting. So to summarize it, there were a whole variety of issues. I've only touched on some of the more important ones, but they all crystallized under the form of, is the CRC a denomination that really still holds to the high view of Scripture that was its historical position and espoused in its confessions?
Next time on MarsCast, we'll continue the story by examining how concerned consistories organized themselves, the consistorial conferences, the Alliance of Reformed Churches, and that pivotal First Synod in Linwood, Illinois, where the URCNA was born. To our listeners, if you found this episode helpful, share it with your consistory, your congregation, or anyone interested in Reformed Church history. This has been MarsCast, the podcast of Mid-America Reformed Seminary. Thank you for listening. I'm Jared Luchabor. I'll catch you next time.